famous name here in Clinton, and they started their lives together in New York, and that's where Al Altman was born. Later, they moved to Clinton. I don't know exactly why or when, and if one of the Altman family members knows about that, we'd appreciate it to make our records complete. They had 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. Al was the youngest, and Al was the firstborn, and George was the last. Now, you see here on the screen, Louis Altman, used furniture. That's what he started his business with. You say used furniture. Well, this was the 1900s, and people were building a lot of houses in Clinton, and it was not unusual to get good used furniture. If you think it's funny, a block from where his store was, on 20 Water Street, we have a building 56, and they have all the best used furniture you would ever find, and it's really fantastic stuff. It's a block away. It's amazing. So it's at 28 Water Street. If you look at the awning on the front of the store, you can read it. It says, George buys and sells anything. That's what I had to read. Now that was his son. Eventually, after Louis died, George took over the business, and he was doing just about everything out of the building. What was Clinton like? Well, Clinton was booming. It was the 1900s. I just found an old picture. This is what the town looked like in 1900. They were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the town of Clinton, and big time. So it wasn't a small place. There was a lot of business here, and there was a lot of things going on. The Altman family moved from the used furniture into new furniture. We found an old ad. There were some heaters and 1941 model radios for $12.95, as well as all kind of furniture. They weren't the only ones. We had Weber and Rose. A lot of folks in town remember Weber and Rose. I love this. This is the Philco Jubilee Special. It's a radio. It also plays 78 RPMs. That was the record at the time. But it doesn't have a needle. It has a beam that reads the record, similar to what a CD is nowadays. I mean, it's amazing. And also, for 25 bucks, you can buy an attachment so that you can record your own music, your own song, your own words, and play it back. That was 1941. I didn't know that technology even existed in 1941, but they did. We found a receipt from the Altman Furniture Company, Mr. and Mrs. McDonald. I wanted to show you this because it shows he or she went in and bought a stove and had it delivered. It was $229. There were no credit cards in those days. You had to be a person of good note because the merchant gave you this item. And if you were known as the person that didn't pay your bills, you probably would not have been able to buy in many of the stores. And you see where she comes in and paid off. She put a deposit of $200 down and brought it down to $29. Went back in June 19th, gave another $5. Went back in June 30th, gave another $2. And then finally came back and paid the whole thing off for $22. That's the way business was done in the old days. So Dave Altman ran the Altman Furniture Store. We have a picture here of him in his high school picture. And Milton had his picture, and we have his family here right in the front row here. That was a picture of him from his Clinton High School yearbook. And he joined Dave, and he took over when Dave died in 1957. Now, you look on the right of this, there is a list of Jewish stores in Clinton. And there was a lot of them. People forget how many there were. I grew up, and I know many of you here today shopped at all these stores. I mean, Altman Furniture is done alphabetically. The reason they had this in the paper is because it was a Jewish holiday coming up, and wanted everybody to know that the stores would be closed. Now, my first suit was at Gould's Men's Shop, like probably most of the guys in town. You see George Gould, you get your suit, you get your tie, you get your shirt, your shoes, the whole bit. So we did shop there. I say, why were there so many here? Well, Clinton was a boom town. Clinton was an immigrant town. We had Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Greek, French Canadians. Look at this town. There's a lot of mills here. Those mills were full of people, and those people were working. And at one point, we had 5,000 people working in the mills. Think about that. In the old days, 1 week, which would be a 72-hour work week, by the way, for $10 was what they would earn. You say, well, what's that? That's not nothing. That's nothing. 10 times 5,000, you got $50,000 a week payroll just from that. And that doesn't count the managers, the owners, and everybody had horses back then. Cars were not invented. You'd have people take care of horses, feed the horses, repair the carts. So there was a lot of money that could only be spent right here in downtown Clinton. There was no internet, there was no Amazon. You spent it where you worked, where you lived. So every major company at the time was on Main Street, on High Street in Clinton. I'm talking Woolworth, I'm talking J.J. Newberry, W.T. Grant, Sears, everybody was here. And that's the reason this was the place, if you're going to open a business, it was a good place to be. I want to take a minute to talk about a classmate of mine, class of 1961. That's my high school classmate. And that was Wilma Altman. A lot of folks here, I think, probably remember who she was. And if everything worked out, she'd be sitting here in the audience watching this show tonight. Unfortunately, cancer got her, and she died at 24 years old. So it's pretty sad. Her younger sister, a lot of people know, Lois Altman, she married George Joseph. There's their pictures up there. And she had an older brother, and that was Charles Altman. He goes by the name of Chuck now. He likes to be called Chuck. And this is his son here and his grandson. He's first row. Happy to have them with us. I was talking to Chuck, and he said, yeah, we used to go down to the furniture store, and we'd help bring furniture in, move furniture out, clean up the place, and do that. He said, yeah, especially in the summertime, it was hot. He says, we used to lock it up, and we go across the street. There was a bar over there. The guys would get a beer, we get a cold drink. This is a bar? I said, yeah, I know about that bar. That was my father's bar. So talk about the connection. That was the gathering. It was my father here in a certain time. And all the gang, this was like cheers. Everybody knew your name. Him and his three brothers went to World War II. They all came back, good. And they opened this bar on Water Street. Now, both the bar and the furniture store are both gone now. There's both parking lots right now. So that was, I didn't realize we had an Altman connection that went back that far. I want to talk about another sad thing. There's a lot of sadness in the Altman family. First was on Louis Altman. Louis had the store, in the furniture store. And I was going through our archives up at the Holder, and we have every edition of the Clinton item that was ever printed. So if you're doing genealogy and dates you have, and you want to do some further research, please come up. We will help you find births and deaths and stories. If your family owned a business, they probably had an ad. It's nice to have that to add to your collection. But the thieves broke into Louis Altman furniture store one night, and they forced him downstairs, hit him over the head, and tried to kill him. Didn't do it. He started screaming. His neighbors came to his rescue, and the thieves were captured. Years later, after he died, George took over the business. And George expanded the selection. He had rare coins and rare Winchester firearms. It is said that he had a collection that was better than the Winchester Company had themselves. He had some real rare stuff. So one night, December 1972, two thieves broke into the store again. Again, they hit George over the head with a stove poker, and they wound up murdering him. His sister, Mrs. Pauline Hill, was visiting her brother. She was living in Framingham. She heard all the call come. She was staying with him, so she heard the commotion, and she called the police. And the intruders heard her upstairs, and they took off. Now, the intruders fled to Puerto Rico. They were from New York. They had heard about all the guns. They came out here and broke in. Now, the Puerto Rican community was just kind of moving into Clinton, and it was wild. And Esteban Mendoza, who was one of the leaders, he was furious that somebody from Puerto Rico would do this. That they weren't from his community, but they were the same nationality. They created some money they sent members of the Clinton Puerto Rican community over to Puerto Rico to find these guys. And they found them,
It's quite a story.
turned them over to the police, who eventually brought them back to trial back in this country. So that's the story of George Altman. Now we're going to talk about somebody else. Al Altman, Clinton High School, class of 1914. We went through and found his picture, and his nickname was Izzy. You say, oh, how could Al's name be Izzy? Because Al's real name is Isidore Irving Altman. And most people think of him as Al. If they do research on Al, you're probably not going to find that his actual real name was Isidore Irving. And you see him up here on top with Lucille Lucero. Who was that? That's Joan Crawford. That's how they all change their name when they get to Hollywood. Oops, hit the wrong button. Here we have a picture of Al on the Metro Golden Bear Studios, behind the scenes, filming some of his proteges. He had quite a few of them. We have a story from the Clinton item, 1935. The factors that endured Al to his cronies and friends in Clinton, and he still has a soft spot in his heart in his old hometown. And despite the calls for business and everything else, he always allocates at least twice a year to come back to visit his father and mother and the resident family members, the rest of the Altman family members. And it was a couple of years back, he brought back with him some of his great discoveries, Joan Crawford and Frechette Tone. Now these were major stars of the day. Imagine nowadays if they would bring home some major stars to the streets of Clinton, the place would be going crazy. I want to show a couple of the stars that he found. Celeste Holm. Now, she was an Academy Award winner. You might have known, she's going back a few years, the younger folks will know her. Everybody will know this guy. He founded Bob Hope.
Wow.
John Forsythe. And that was Bachelor Father Dynasty. Trouble with Harry, that was just on TV. That's a good little movie, and I saw that. And probably this guy is probably best known, Jimmy Stewart. I was watching Rear Window, Liberty Valance. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is showing that more and more nowadays. And it's a wonderful life. The Clinton Strand Theater every year for Christmas has a George Bailey Award. It's for anybody in the town that acts like George Bailey, gives back to the community. And they show it every year. Last year when Rob was, after the show, he locked it up, and he was going up he locked up the doors, put all the lights out, he's heading up the alleyway, and he could hear this sound. He says, what the hell is that? And this is what it sounded like.
Merry Christmas, Movie House! Merry Christmas is for you! Merry Christmas, you wonderful Billy and Lou!
Now, we don't know where that came. He came back in, there's nobody here, so maybe the ghost of Jimmy Stewart is still here in the theater, so we'll find out this Christmas if he comes back and pays another visit. Another one of the Altmans is Arthur Altman from this town. Now, Arthur was a magician, a master magician. At age 15, he was performing at all of the civic groups in Clinton, and that's where he got his start. But he was so famous, everybody's heard of Houdini. He was as famous as Houdini. In fact, Al was also a magician. Al Altman was a magician. Arthur was a magician. Arthur was so good that Houdini was ready to appoint him as succeed him as the president of the Society of American Magicians. That's fantastic. But there was a third Altman magician in the family. You might have seen him on TV. And that's Jeff Altman. He was Arthur's son. Now, he's a magician. They all did sleight of hand. It was coins and card tricks they were doing. But Jeff's better known as a comedian. You see him on the left here with David Letterman in a New York Renaissance fair. This is before both of them were famous. As actors, you take whatever gig you can get to get a few dollars. And that was way before they were famous. Later on, Dave got famous, got his own program, and he stuck with Jeff. he had him on over 41 different times on his show. And Jeff also had a bit role, a reoccurring role in The Dukes of Hazzard as Hughie Hogg. so he was getting around. It's amazing. Well, we were looking through the archives, and we found a rare video clip of Jeff on the David Letterman show, and where he talks about Al and Arthur and about the magician part. So it's going to be interesting. You might like it.
Ladies and gentlemen, here he is, the one, the only Jeff Altman. The facets of your life in show business are infinite, multivariate and infinite. Thank you. I remember years and years ago I met your father. I believe late in his life. Yeah. A nice fellow. What was his first name? Arthur. And Arthur, your father, and his brother,
my brother Al, who was one of the talent scouts for Metro Goldwyn Mayer.
Right. Yes.
And my dad, who was a very talented magician.
Yeah. And you also love magic. Did you learn it from your father?
I did. I learned a lot of stuff from my dad when I went to college in Baltimore. I learned some stuff from a fellow named Frank Thompson and later Ricky Jay, Steve Freeman.
Ricky Jay's been on the show.
Yeah,
I did a wonderful documentary. Ricky Jay's done several films. A fine actor as well. Yeah. And then who was the other guy?
We can only show you so much about Al. We know a little bit. We have someone here with us tonight, his daughter, who knows a heck of a lot more about Al. And we're talking to her about maybe coming back at a future date at the Holder Memorial and doing a full hour-and-a-half, 2-hour program on Al and the history of MGM and the movies. So we're working that out. We're going to work around her schedule and our finances and everything else. But that's in the works. We're working on it. But right now, I'd like to give a big clip and welcome to Diana Altman, Al Altman's daughter.
Many years ago, many years ago, when I was a child, and that was long before the Strand was renovated and looked as wonderful as it does now, I thought the manager of the Strand had really bad taste. And the reason I thought that was that every time I visited Clinton, the marquee boasted a movie I'd never heard of, with actors I had never heard of. I came 2 or 3 times a year with my father to visit my grandmother on Water Street and my uncles who had a furniture store on High Street, and I would go with my cousins to the Strand Theater, and I would sit there wondering, why is this theater so different from Lowe's and RKO and Paramount? I had no idea that the manager of the Strand was a victim of what we call the studio system. And the studio system was extremely beneficial to a lot of people, my father included, but not at all beneficial to the Strand or to any of the other hundreds of independent theaters like the Strand across the country. I didn't know that the manager of the Strand couldn't show anything but obscure movies. So tonight, I'm going to talk about why that was the way it was. What was the studio system? What does that mean? The studio system describes an era of film history when the great theater corporations of New York owned the Hollywood studios. You might say that the person who owned the store also owned the factory that sent the product to the store, if you think of the theater as a store, which of course it is. So why, if you're manufacturing the product for your stores, would you give it to a store that wasn't yours? You wouldn't. and the Strand was somebody else's store. Oh, sorry. It's hard to see the lighting. If we examine Lowe's Theatre Corporation and take it as an example, we can see that the studio system evolved organically. Let's go back to 1904, and let's look at Marcus Lowe. And in those days, movies were called flickers because they stayed on the screen just for a few minutes and flickered. They were shown in converted stores with set-up chairs, folding chairs that were set up. They were entertainment for poor people. Wealthy people went to the Broadway stage or to the opera. Immigrants came, and they brought their children, and they brought their lunches. Louis B. Mayer had a Nickelodeon in Haverhill, and the wealthy people in town referred to it as the garlic box, contemptuously. These flickers would show a mosquito, and it would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it would swap the man, or there was a lot of trick photography. There would be a candle flame, and a beautiful little fairy would float up from the candle. And then there was something called actualities, and one of those showed the digging of the first New York City subway. Because the price of these picture halls was usually a nickel, they were often called Nickelodeons. Marcus Lowe, he would eventually become my father's boss, started working at the age of 6 selling newspapers on the Lower East Side. And if you read about the Lower East Side, from the point of view of the social workers who went there, it's, you just hear about all the squalid conditions and how crowded it was. But if you examine the records of the people who actually lived among the pushcarts, you find that there was a lot of street entertainment. Opera singers came there, jugglers, brass bands, they all came, and they performed for a penny. And if you didn't have a penny, you could still see this entertainment. And Marcus Lowe really did not believe that entertainment was a luxury. He thought it was a necessity. And he thought it was a necessity especially for tired and poor people. So I mention that because, of course, he went into business to make money, but he also had this higher purpose, which was to bring entertainment to poor people. And from all accounts, he was really lovable, and everybody seemed to love him. And it started to bother him. Well, because he was such a well-liked person, eventually he had Lowe's theaters all across the country, and it started to bother him that the pictures he was showing from factories called Vitagraph and Biograph, most of them were in New York, they had titles like The Gay Divorcee or Beware, My Husband Comes. And he knew that there were a lot of mothers in his audience, and they were there with their children. And he didn't want to embarrass them. So he thought the way to control what he showed in the theaters was to buy a factory of his own. And he bought a factory called Metro for $15,000. And as luck would have it, this was a failing factory. One of the first movies that they ever produced after being owned by Marcus Lowe had this unknown tango dancer in it. And his name was Rudolph Valentino. So Metro went from being nothing to being the biggest studio in America. And of course, then it had to expand. So Marcus Lowe bought a $14 million movie facility that had been built by Sam Goldwyn, who was no longer working for Goldwyn Pictures. And now he had Metro Goldwyn, and he showed those movies in Lowe's theaters. At the same time that this was happening, European people were making movies too. And their movies were I think you could say better by a lot than ours, because the theater owners in America, for some reason, thought that people couldn't sit still for more than 10 minutes. But the European theater owners knew that their audiences could see feature films that lasted an hour and a half. And when American audiences saw those films from Europe, they really liked them. And if it weren't for World War I, I think that Europe might have stayed ahead of us in movie sophistication. But what happened was the war came, and the meadows that had been used as stage sets now had dead bodies all over them, and the actors were drafted, and studios were used to store ammunition. And because the American audiences loved these feature films so much, our theater owners realized they couldn't make them sit in those uncomfortable folding chairs. And so around 1914 began the era of the movie palace, which some of you have heard of, and velvet seats and ushers, and tickets cost $2. Well, then, when the flow of films stopped from Europe, the theater owners had these massive theater palaces, and so they begged American producers to please make longer movies. And they started to do that, and one of the first ones was The Birth of a Nation. In 1924, Marcus Lowe hired Louis B. Mayer to be the head of MGM. And at that time, my father had been working for Louis B. Mayer in Boston. And at that time, he sent him to New York to find movie talent on the Broadway stage, because then all movie stars were former stage actors. Lillian Gish was, Mary Pickford. The problem was that if you had a stage career, you really didn't want to be in the movies because it was considered low-class entertainment. But that was my father's job, and he went to a play that was starring somebody called Mistange, and this was in 1925. And he was supposed to try to convince her to be in the movies. Her legs, so this was the hype, was that her legs were insured for $1 million. But there was a chorus girl at the show who he found more interesting than Mistange, and he asked her to come in for a screen test. And screen tests were shot on 54th Street and 10th Avenue, which was the home of Movietone newsreels. And the first screen test that he shot of this girl was rejected because you have to remember it was silent, so she was just dancing, so they didn't like it. So he thought, she really has something. So he sat her down and he just started asking her questions with the cameras rolling, like, do you have a pet? Do you get along with your mother? What was the worst subject in school, And all these questions were meant to disarm her so that you could see the real expression of her face. And that test was accepted, and Al called that the ad-lib screen test, and he used that ad-lib screen test for the rest of his career. So the girl went out to California, and they had a contest, a movie magazine contest, to see what they should call her, and the name that won was Joan Crawford. So now with Joan Crawford, who had absolutely no acting experience, she was from a very miserable background, as leaked out. Now if she could be a movie star, then that meant anybody could. So that was the beginning of that myth. And all the farmers' daughters started thinking of being movie stars, and so did the valets and the hat check girls. And if Joan Crawford could be a star, then that meant that my father didn't have to necessarily go to the Broadway stage. A star could be found anywhere. She could be at the cosmetic counter or working in the bank. So he was a big fan of Buffalo Bill, the Indian Scout, and he coined the phrase talent scout. And from then on, talent could be found anywhere. His job was not to find actors for a specific movie. His job was to find what was called personalities. There was a constant cry from Hollywood for new faces. And when the new face screen test was accepted, the person was sent out to Hollywood and put on contract for 7 years. They were given singing and dancing lessons. They had clothes especially designed for them. They had articles written about them for movie magazines. And then they were tried in various roles in various films to see if the audience liked them and would make them a star. Well, you can imagine that keeping a stable of stars on contract for 7 years, hoping that one of them will be a star, that's very, very expensive. And the way that happened was that money from the Lowe's theaters flowed into MGM. So the movies that MGM produced didn't support MGM. The Lowe's theaters did, and after a while, Lowe's owned a sheet music company and a record company, and that money from that flowed out to the studio too. The same thing can be said for Paramount, RKO, Warner Brothers. So that was what the studio system was. But then you have a theater like the Strand, and the Strand has no connection at all to any studio. The only films that the Strand and others like the Strand could show were films made by indie movie producers. But they weren't all that satisfied. First of all, they had no budget at all, and they couldn't afford to have chorus girls dancing on the roofs of buildings in Times Square. They had no money for styling the people. They had no money at all. And they were very dissatisfied because their films could only be shown in little indie theaters, and what they wanted was to have, because some of those movies were great, and they would rather have them in the big movie palace on Broadway than in a little theater, say, in Billerica. So in the late 1950s, the independent theater owners and the independent filmmakers joined together, and they took the big 5 studios to court and said that they were a monopoly. And they won. And the theaters were forced to divorce themselves from the studios. And now MGM had to support itself without that flow of money. So no longer could actors be signed to a 7-year contract, no longer could they be given dancing and singing lessons. And now, instead of a stable of stars, the actors just tried out for a specific role, and every movie was cast individually. And what happened was that MGM found it was too expensive to make movies. So they started buying the movies of independent movie producers. My father died when I was 20.